Good evening. Sorry about the late start. We're having technical difficulties that sometimes occurs, but we are very pleased that you are with us this evening. You are joining a policy forum with the Libre Institute. We work to educate on all things that promote a free society and keeps America from sliding into a sort of a top-down centralized system. One of those systems is socialism, and that's what we'll be talking about today. Socialism, frankly, is the big lie of the 20th century. While it promised prosperity, equality, and security, it has only delivered poverty, misery, and tyranny everywhere it's been tried. Equality was achieved only in the sense that everyone was equal in his or her misery. In the long run, socialism has always proven to be a formula for tyranny and misery because it is a system that ignores incentives, market signals. Given the ignorance of so many, especially young Americans, who are being indoctrinated with pie in the sky attributions about socialism and told that market economy are inherently evil, or market economies are inherently evil, telling the truth about socialism has taken on a new urgency. If we do not, the proponents of this failed system, economic illiterates really, will fill the vacuum with misinformation. This is the truth about socialism. It is an economic system based on distorted notions about human nature, and it requires wishfulness and naivete to sustain the pseudo-religion that it has spawned. But in practical terms, it has to be enforced by political tyranny. To detail this further, we have two exceptional guests this evening with us today. I want to introduce them before moving to them. Rachel Campos Duffy is a published author, a communications consultant, and a television personality specializing in political analysis and culture and parenting. She is a Fox News and Fox Business contributor, offering her unique views on political news, on parenting, and everything in between. She is a reoccurring guest host on the network's hit shows Fox and Friends and Outnumbered. She is also the host of her own show, Moms, on Fox Nation, the network's digital platform. Her advocacy work includes serving as the national spokesperson for the Libre Initiative, a nonprofit group that advocates for the economic empowerment of Hispanics through limited government entrepreneurship and self-reliance. And we really valued her time during that stint. Rachel recently authored a best-selling children's book called Paloma Wants to Be Lady Freedom, inspired by real-life events, actually. It is the story of a little girl's adventure inside the US Capitol, where she learns about patriotism, courage, and her immigrant's father's journey to citizenship. Rachel has a bachelor's degree in economics from Arizona State University's honors program and a master's degree in international affairs from the University of California in San Diego. Rachel lives in Wisconsin with her husband, former Congressman Sean Duffy of Wisconsin, and her 9 incredible, awesome kids. John Suarez is the executive director at the Center for a Free Cuba. Mr. Suarez was a program officer for Latin American programs at Freedom House. He has been interviewed by television, radio, and print media on Cuba. Mr. Suarez is a human rights activist. He holds degrees from Florida International University and Spain's Universidad Francisco de Vitoria. He has testified before the US Congress and the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights in Washington, D.C., the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva, and has also served as an interpreter for Cuban dissidents in congressional hearings. Since 2009, he has maintained the blog Notes from the Cuban Exile Quarter. So really pleased that we can have these two exceptional guests with us. So I'm going to start off with a fundamental question that I'll go to Rachel first, and then of course John can answer the same question. So I'm going to start off with a very fundamental question. Rachel, what exactly is socialism?
Well, actually, I knew you were going to ask me that, so I actually wrote down the official definition. I want our viewers to hear that official definition. Then we can talk a little bit about how it affects us and how it plays out in our lives. So it is an economic theory that advocates for the means of production, distribution, and exchange that it be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Sounds really nice, actually. But in reality, what it is a very centralized system. And so instead of letting power go to basically most power to the family unit, which is the most important unit of any society. That power is given over to state governments, to federal governments. And what we see is that it doesn't work very well for people. And we're seeing it even during this pandemic playing out, how this one size fits all cookie cutter edicts that are coming from governors and even from the federal government are not working for people. They're causing people to lose their livelihoods. We're seeing the greatest transfer of wealth from the working class to the rich and the privileged. And we're seeing that the resources are not being properly allocated because it's all being centralized.
John, I'll pass it to you.
Well, I agree, obviously, with what Rachel just gave as that definition. I think it's also interesting to see the evolution of socialism, because if you go back to the 19th century, there was an idea that it wasn't necessarily a centralized government responsibility. So you had the utopian socialists, where people got together and set up model communities, and they typically failed after a year or two, but there wasn't a great loss of life, as you've seen with the modern variant of socialism, because the utopian socialists were trying to persuade others and get people together to join in this attempt to have a cooperative venture. They failed because you didn't have those market mechanisms that are much more efficient to allocating, setting price, and also being able to provide goods and services in a community. But it didn't lead to the loss of life until you get to the Marxists, in Karl Marx, obviously, and the idea that you have to force people to be free, also echoing a bit of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in another bloodbath, which is the French Revolution. And that's where the problem is. It's one thing if you're saying that people can freely join together to try and advance a cooperative, and it may work or it may not. The pattern has been that it's one of failure. But when you say that you have to have the force of the state, of the coercive force of the state to enforce this policy, even if it is a failure, that's when you get the racking up of large numbers of dead people.
So, John, you talk about the coercion of state and how you have to force people into compliance or to, of course, fit into this model, especially those dissidents who are just stubbornly want to, be free. By failing to emphasize, like you were also talking about, incentives. Socialism then is a theory inconsistent with human nature and is therefore doomed to fail, and it always has. Like I had mentioned. The socialism is based on the theory that incentives don't matter almost, right? If that's the case, one has to ask, does socialism even look for solutions, or is it just a type of social control system?
Well, theoretically, they don't push incentives, but in practice, and I can talk about the system in Cuba, they do force people to work. If you do not work, you are considered a social parasite. You are potentially jailed for 4 years under a crime known as pre-crime. So there are consequences and there are incentives for you to work. Now, there isn't a market to work, so you're dealing with a centralized command economy, and it's a disaster. But if you don't work, you are jailed. If you are homeless and you are trying to panhandle, you are jailed. You need not be doing anything else. Or, as we had the case of Severio Portal Contreras, since you don't have wealth being generated, and you have a centralized planned economy, you have sections of Havana where the buildings are literally collapsing and people have been killed, young children included. Severio Portal Contreras was screaming and demanding that the dilapidated buildings be addressed, that it was a human threat. He ended up doing over 2 years in prison because of that. So it's an issue that, one, there's a centralized planned economy controlled by a dictatorship of the workers, is what they say in theory. In reality, the Communist Party usually controlled by someone, in this case, the Castro family. And there's no room for dissent or conversation as you have in a free society. Reinaldo Arenas, Cuban writer who died in 1990, December 7th of 1990, described his experience arriving in the US. He said that the difference between communism and capitalism was that in communism, when they kicked you in a sensitive spot, in communism, you had to applaud and ask for another hit. In capitalism, at least you could scream. Now,
Yeah.
the thing is that in capitalism, it seems trivial, but the ability to scream and to complain when something is going wrong is how you begin to be able to address the problem and find a solution. That's prohibited under the communist.
But I want to pick up on that, John, because I think it's so important as we, put this in real practical terms. I think over the last year, the last 9 months in particular, but really, I mean, it started long before the pandemic. You said there was no room for dissent. Aren't we seeing that more and more often here? That there's no room for dissent, that there are punishments for people who have a different opinion, or that those different opinions might cost you your job, might cause social ostracization, or that it's just down and out censored. So, it's interesting, when I was a lot younger and I heard all those stories about Cuba, it seemed so far away. It seemed so impossible to happen here. And just in, my adult life in the last few years, I have seen a normalization of this. And as a mom, and Daniel mentioned that I do a lot of segments about family and kids. I have 9 kids. I love kids. I'm very concerned about our future for that reason. And I'm very concerned pre-pandemic, but now on overdrive with the pandemic, about the normalization of compliance among our kids. I'm very concerned about the normalization of how, I'm seeing more government edicts, more centralized control, more people telling us, when we can go to church, if we can go to church, what we're doing, monitoring our movements on a level I never experienced in my childhood. And as a parent, I'm wondering, how is that impacting my kids? They are so young. They are so formative. It's kind of scary. And it's something that, I've been wanting to talk to people who have lived in Cuba as children. Like, what does that do to you to see that? There's always going to be that rebellious person, right? But what about somebody who's a naturally compliant person, or just so young that they just don't know any different?
Well, I mean, what about that, John? What Rachel is talking about, it has been breathtaking, to see how fast government has moved in and mobilized and flexed its muscle, right? That it's almost something to behold, right? How much power of coercion the government has. And you were talking about, you're jailed and you're jailed for this. It almost sounds like the Fred Armisen's SNL skit. If you do this, you go to jail. If you do that, you go to jail. We've arrived almost at that situation. The question was going to be, how fast or how accelerated is the process where government begins to clamp down on dissidents? But here we're almost seeing it in real time in America.
Lamentably, I agree. I think one of the reasons that, and I hear it from in the Cuban American community, the fear that they've seen this, they've been to this rodeo before when you talk to the older generation. And in the case of Cuba, it was very quick. You had an authoritarian dictator with Fulgencio Batista. You had Fidel Castro pledging a restoration of democracy, of elections. And as soon as he got in, while he was still screaming about human rights and press freedoms, he was sending his thugs to threaten and silence the press, and to ensure that there would only be positive press. Otherwise, those individuals in the press would be killed. And then within a year, the press was taken over and shut down. What's interesting is, in the current environment, we talk a lot of, for example, President Trump was talking about the enemy of the press and was very public about his attacks of the press. But we don't hear much about what the Obama administration did, and President Obama specifically. Trump has been very loud and aggressive, but in terms of doing stuff to journalists, he hasn't done much. Obama was very quiet and stealthy, but some journalists went to prison on his watch, more so than under Trump's watch. And that's what's fearful. If you have people saying the right things about human rights and democracy, but quietly doing just the opposite. And we do see that happening here in the United States these days. It is a concern. I think that unfortunately, the expansion of the state into the private sector has been going on since the time of FDR. But if we look at what took place in 2008 with the banking crisis, that was a situation where I think I've heard the term moral hazard, where people in the banking sector and the finance sector made poor choices. And rather than having to face the consequences that the market would impose, the government was there to rescue them. And how did they do it? By transferring wealth from the middle class and the poor to the wealthy bankers. And I think that's part of the reason that you have this hostility to capitalism, because then the hardcore leftists say that that is capitalism or the free market. And it's just the opposite. It's, at best you could call it crony capitalism, but it's the state selecting winners and losers, not the market.
And but another point on this, and maybe you could, John, you're maybe the perfect person to talk to about this, because again, I'm a regular citizen. Yes, I'm a political analyst, but I'm experiencing this in real time, right? What's going on, what we're experiencing right now. And one of the things that's really troubled me is we've seen more and more footage come out of business owners asking, putting out viral videos saying, why is my outdoor restaurant being shut down, but this outdoor restaurant that the government has said is, or is friends with the government, it's a movie industry, that one's okay. You see the pain in her eyes. And again, we talk about this transfer of wealth. I mean, the one class of people that's most difficult to manage and to control is the middle class, is the entrepreneur, small business class. They're financially independent. They're not dependent on government as much. They're not tied to the government as much as big businesses. And so they're the unruly class. And what I'm worrying, and you tell me, John, if I'm crazy as I'm seeing this, but I'm seeing this disempowerment economically and otherwise of the middle class. If you can take down the middle class, it's so much easier to control the population.
Yeah, 100%. Look, I want to remind our audience that you can ask questions on our Facebook, and we're going to be actually taking questions from our social media platforms in a little bit after I get done with my questions and answers. So, and there's also an option where you can go to a site where this is being translated also into Spanish. Rachel, you were talking about the reaction that children may have, to what they are seeing in real time play out. I think another, which reminded me, another of the reasons why socialism fails is because it kills and destroys the human spirit. You can only take so much indignities, right, from your government. And just ask the people leaving Cuba. John knows about this, in homemade rafts and boats, and those waiting in long lines today in Venezuela, struggling and often, failing to buy food. Look, the term socialism was thrown around quite a bit in the last election, especially in areas like Florida. Is socialism really a threat in the US, or is this just a scare tactic, John?
Well, I think that what I find worrisome is that we've had socialism in the US, but a different variant, which is, I would argue, social democracy. And I think that goes back to FDR and the New Deal. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Democrats of that era, and I would say and still today, a sector of the Democratic Party, are what I would call social democrats, which recognize the market as the fundamental basis for the national economy, but then want to regulate it and have redistribution of wealth to set up a safety net and humanize it. But there's another current now in the Democratic Party, which are democratic socialists, and they do not recognize the market as the source for generating wealth in our society. They view it as something fundamentally evil that needs to be replaced, and have a more rational basis for the control of the means of production through government. And I think that is an existential threat to America and to Americans, because that would lead to the implosion of the economy, the complete destruction of the middle class. And to Rachel's question, I think that free societies depend on a strong middle class. And to have that strong middle class, you do need many small businesses to be hiring and to have that vibrant society that people have access to, that aren't beholden to politicians in Washington.
It is, you'd rather see wealth permeating from the bottom up, from the inside out, from the outside in, from top down, just a permeation, not a trickle down, right? Because that's what we're talking about when, the market generates wealth. And Rachel, to John's point, for the first time in the history of the world, by the way, the day is coming very soon when a majority of the people in the world will live in free societies or societies, that rapidly moving towards freedom. Why then are we seeing a tendency towards socialist ideas in our policies in America today?
Well, it's ironic here as well, because, pre-pandemic, we had an explosion. We had an economy that was historic. And it was, we hear those who propose socialism and other policies, liberal policies. They're always talking about, income inequality and, distributing wealth and all this stuff. But under that Trump economy, which was an entrepreneurial, emphasis on small business, deregulation, getting the economy moving, we saw that it was the working class that had the fastest wages going out. We saw income inequality starting to level out. We saw Hispanics and Blacks, people who had done so poorly in other, under other administrations, really start to have an economic growth that was historical, never before seen. More people rising out of poverty than we've ever seen in these classes. And so, it's interesting that you have that. And at the same time, you have young people who are polled, over and over again, who say they like socialism. Oh, they prefer to live under socialism over capitalism. Now, the one thing that gives me a little bit of hope is that when polls just ask that, it frightens us, right? We see all these kids that say that. But then when you ask them more direct questions, do you want the government involved in, say, if you get really specific, do you want the government running your microbrewery? Do you want the government running your taco truck down the street? They say, no, they don't. And in fact, Generation Z, not the millennials, but Gen Z, when polled, comes out as the most entrepreneurial generation of all. And so there's a lot of hope in it. But the problem is that some of the stars that have risen out in our political system, and I say namely, especially as we're, at the Libre Institute, and so many Hispanics know who she is, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She's a protege of Bernie Sanders. And Bernie Sanders and her, but Bernie Sanders in particular will say, well, no, I'm talking more about Sweden. And he names all these Northern European countries that, frankly, some of them have more economic liberty than we do here. That's not what he was talking about. He was a big proponent of and a big cheerleader for the revolution in Cuba and the one in Venezuela. And in fact, it was only a few years ago, maybe 8 years ago, on his website, he said that you were more likely to find the American dream in Venezuela than in the United States of America. And of course, when, their economy went into the tank, he quietly took that off of his website, but he's never been able to, no one's ever really asked him about that. Another thing, Daniel, that gives me some hope in all of this, and I think we'll talk a little later about our education system, but social media is so important, and there are so many socialistic messages being pushed on our kids through social media. Just this week, I saw a young man, he's a TikTok star, and he has been going into Latin America and interviewing the Venezuelan refugees in Ecuador and other countries. And so finally, young people might actually get to see up close what happens when you fall for the lies, the promises of free stuff, and all those things that socialists promise. And then it never ends up well. You end up, in this case, as a refugee in another country, hungry, wondering how you're going to feed your family. It always leads to destruction.
Yeah, John. So to Rachel's point, so America is an exceptional country. It is the wealthiest nation in the world. Our market economy has allowed for that wealth and that innovation that spurs invention and creation of incredible products that improves the quality of life. Yet, it is this society that is ceding away its liberties, its freedoms, bit by bit. We are centralizing and consolidating more power in the hands of politicians in Washington, D.C., our money, control of things like education, healthcare, family, church. The government is starting to usurp these roles of the parents. Why are we allowing this to happen?
Well, I'd also like to dovetail with what Rachel just said about Senator Sanders. In addition to Venezuela and Cuba and honeymooning in Moscow in the period of the Soviet Union, in the presidential primary debates of the Democratic Party, he made a point, in addition to pointing out Cuba as a positive model, of claiming that China had brought more people out of poverty than any other country in the world. I think that's aged very badly, considering that trillions of dollars have been lost in this pandemic that could have been prevented if China had been more transparent and had done a better job of containing the spread of the pandemic instead of disappearing and punishing the whistleblowers who tried to warn the world back in December, January, and February of this year. But to your point, I think that what's been going on over the last generation is that the hard left has been doing a job, and I think we have to look at the Italian Marxist, cultural Marxist, Gramsci, which saw that it was difficult to overthrow a free society just looking at the economic question, but you have to look at the cultural question. And these cultural Marxists did an analysis of the US, and they saw that the ways that American values are transmitted through the family, through high schools, and through the university were avenues that they would try to take over. And they have done that in the academy. And you do see, I mean, I graduated from Florida National University in '92, and even back then, there was a dominant influence of Marxists in the economics department and the poli-sci department. And I remember in the sociology anthropology section, they even had a poster of Mao. And this was on a campus that was relatively conservative back then. And things have only gotten worse. Speech codes. The idea of freedom of expression has greatly eroded over the last 30 years. And that's where you have this idea that if you say many Americans, and we see the polls, are afraid to express their political views because they fear punishment, being fired from their job. That is not how a free society is supposed to operate. You're supposed to be able to have unpopular opinions.
I want to get back to this point that you guys were making about Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders. If socialism has never succeeded anywhere and has been the world's most spectacular failure in human engineering, what then are the supposed solutions that AOC and Bernie Sanders have figured out, or that others claim will come at the hands of socialist policies? What are they proposing that is above and beyond what has absolutely failed and crashed in the past?
Well, they're proposing ideas that sound really great, right? Equality and justice, and everyone gets something, and redistribution, and the things that they say all sound nice. It's how do you get there, and what freedoms do you have to lose in order for them to do that? And as you mentioned earlier, how poor do we all have to get in order to do that?
Yeah, well,
and what we
Rachel,
saw,
I mean, like,
yes,
I'm sorry to interrupt, but specifically, let's just take healthcare, for example. They propose Medicare for all that
right,
would undo employment-based insurance and private insurance for everybody. That doesn't sound good. That sounds scary, actually.
right. And when polled, but it goes back to what I said. If you poll people and say, is healthcare a human right? Should the government give healthcare to everybody? Everybody will say yes. It polls really great. But then if you ask them, how do you feel about your employer no longer being able to offer you an insurance plan to pick from? They don't like that. So again, they play off of not having the details and not having the specifics. And again, I want to go back. AOC is a very dangerous figure. And I say that, first of all, she is a product of our education system. She is quite possibly the best example of what you'll get at the end. She's an econ major, and yet she has been absolutely indoctrinated all the way through. She's a true believer. She's a true acolyte of Bernie Sanders, and she believes it 100%. And so what you're seeing is this normalization, and as people who've studied this and know that free market economies work, that nothing has lifted more people out of poverty and given them more opportunity than capitalism. We know that. By the way, AOC will say that people are coming from Latin America because of climate change. That is something she actually said. No, they are coming here for the economic opportunity that capitalism offers. And so as people who love free enterprise, who want economic liberty and know what its fruits are, we are doing the worst job of passing these ideas on to our children. We have seeded, as John said, the culture, whether it's, in entertainment. Social media is this new space that the messages are subtle, they're being sent out. Marxist messages, sometimes coded in racial justice things that sound, again, on the surface, who doesn't want racial justice? And yet the mission statement for Black Lives Matters has the Marxist message of, the disintegration of the family, because as you know, Marxism requires that your identity not be with your family, it be with the government, with their ideology. All of these things we're seeding, and it can get overwhelming as a parent. When we look at the teachers' colleges that have been overrun by Marxists, when we look at the curriculums that have total blackouts on the death and destruction caused by socialism in the 20th century, our kids don't know it. In fact, when polled, they'll rate Stalin higher than Donald Trump or George Bush because they don't know what Stalin's done. These are all huge problems. And as a parent, they overwhelm you. And I've thought so deeply about this because I've wanted to take on these problems with our education system, with our culture, which I think is normalizing at a dangerous level all of these socialist ideas to our children. And I just think it comes down to coming to ourselves. We have to take.
Rachel.
But let me just make this one point, Daniel. We have to take it ourselves, one child at a time. I can't change the world. I'd love to, but I can teach my own child every day about what socialism looks like, what people are suffering through in Venezuela, how my small business works, the good things small businesses do in my community. All of these things, we need to do it. If we're not talking about socialism with our kids, somebody else is, I promise you.
No, absolutely. I was going to ask, you talk about your children and teaching your children, and I couldn't agree with you more. And I think as leadership in our nation, we have failed to actually beat them with better ideas, right? Or their failed ideas with ideas that are successful. Where are we seeing freedom-minded solutions advanced in a way that furthers the good of all, that can counter these bad ideas?
Well, we're seeing entrepreneurs every day show what the American dream looks like. We're seeing, I look at it on a very micro basis. I mean, I live in a little town where 15 years ago, it was hard to get a good meal here. We're seeing that entrepreneurs, people sharing ideas, making things work, bringing, goods and services, even to little rural towns where I live on a level, every day they're showing that. And that's probably why I'm so alarmed right now at how many of our small businesses are failing now and may never come back because our government has just put the boot on their neck. And for some reason that I can't understand, our big businesses are able to operate and find safe ways to serve customers. But for some reason in Democrat blue states, in particular, small business owners are being squashed.
I just wanted to address a couple of points. I think that one of the difficulties is that although you do have the living example of these small businessmen and women generating wealth in their communities, providing services, people take that for granted. They don't see that as a product of free markets and freedom. They just view it as their birthright. And that's why it's so important to counter the ideas of Karl Marx with the ideas of Ludwig von Mises. I'd recommend his book, Socialism. Everyone should read that as an antidote to the Communist Manifesto. I would recommend reading F.A. Hayek, The Road to Serfdom. I would recommend going through some of the works of Milton Friedman, or Walter Williams, who just passed away recently, a brilliant man. There's a lot of interviews with him on YouTube that I would recommend young people to listen to. He's a lifelong educator who was spreading the ideas of freedom over several generations. Those ideas have consequences. We can see the results of freedom, but for young people who are being indoctrinated in the classroom, they don't understand that that can all go away. And the problem is when the communists take over and they rewrite the textbooks, that history will cease to exist. We're seeing already
Starting to happen.
With the 1619 Project in the New York Times, the idea that they use the term now of plantation capitalism to try to link capitalism or free markets with slavery, and even the founding of the United States. They were trying to make the argument that the founding was no longer 1776, but 1619 when the first slaves came over, which is a lie. And historians, including even Marxist historians, came out and criticized that. But you have to fight against it with truth, with facts, with data. If you just passively assume that young people will see the wealth generated by the society around them and will accept that that's the fruits of freedom, the bottom line is, in a free society, people take that for granted, and they're looking at the defects of freedom, because people in a free society are able to scream. So you're going to see the homelessness, you're going to see the people who don't have access to healthcare. But then the question is, what are the numbers? How does this reflect within the broader general population? What are the possibilities for reforms within the existing system? Rather than what the radical wants to do, which is to tear it all down and bring in a command and control system that we've seen time and time and time again over the past century, not only fails, but kills literally tens of millions of people.
That's right.
And Daniel, you talked about you talked about the healthcare system. I mean, we have a wonderful system of federalism. We should, I'm all for, if California wants to do a socialist healthcare system, let them do it. But then let other states do something else and let this marketplace of ideas play out. Maybe it turns out that there's some combination that actually works in healthcare in particular. I don't know. But the point is, the worst thing we can do is put all of that into the hands of Washington, D.C. and let the federal government decide what's best for all of us. I think we're all going to get worse healthcare. And you see, just north of me here in Canada, the rich people there come down here because they don't want to wait in those lines for healthcare.
No, that's right.
When it's rough.
I also want to return to the idea, the power ideas. And we were discussing how people pull healthcare as a right. Today's the International Human Rights Day, where we recognize the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think freedom-minded people need to push the fact that in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Article 17 recognizes private property as a human right. And I want to read this and underline it. Article 17 states, everyone has the right to own property alone as well as in association with others. No one shall be arbitrarily deprived of his or her property. Now, in the United States is not number one in the world in private property rights. We're not even in the top 10. And we had the Supreme Court decision, the Kelo decision, that actually provided the possibility of local governments to seize property from American citizens when they thought they could get a better deal by tearing down that property and providing it to someone else who'd be able to generate more tax revenue for them. And that goes against the idea of private property rights. And I think we as people who believe in a free society, private property rights, like freedom of expression, are two important pillars needed in a free society.
Absolutely. I think that is one of the freedom-minded solutions that I was asking about. Two other books that I would add to the list that you gave, John, Free to Choose by Milton Friedman and Basic Economics by Thomas Sowell, I think would help. It's a good primer for folks who are trying to understand in a very basic level these concepts that we're talking about. Rachel, one last question before I turn it over to Kennedy Lefebvre, who's going to go to the questions on social media. You know, one of these freedom-minded solutions is educational freedom. It's school choice. It's vouchers, right? It's where we reverse that calculus of centralizing so much power and control in Washington, D.C., and return it back to the parents, to the individual, to choose for themselves the kind of education that they want for their children, instead of politicians restricting your child to their zip code. This is a freedom-minded solution that is embraced by millions of Latinos. Less taxes where people keep more of their money, less regulations where you're free to start a business, energy independence where we can generate so much prosperity. 400,000 jobs are dependent on energy production here in Texas. So I would say to you in Wisconsin, tell me a little bit about how school choice can empower a parent.
Well, again, interestingly and quite ironically, one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that parents are waking up to the idea of school choice and why it's so important. Those parents who, I mean, parents don't want to be beholden to the teachers unions. Right now, we have all the science proving that kids cannot, transmit or die of coronavirus. It's rare. 93 million Chinese children are in school right now. And yet the teachers unions in some of our biggest cities and states have shut down our schools. And so now parents are seeing what it's like when you don't have a choice in education. And of course, like so many other things, those who are privileged have a choice. I know I wake up every morning, Daniel, and my kids go to Catholic school. And so they're in school and I see them bustling around and they're talking about what's going to happen next at school instead of sitting in a Zoom meeting all day long like they did last year for those couple months. And I thank God, one, that I can afford tuition to send them. Others can't. And we ought to make that part of our policy because that tax dollar belongs to the parent for their child's education and not the state. And two, thank God that Catholic schools are open, that we have them, that we have these choices, that we have private schools and charter schools that aren't necessarily tied to the government system and beholden to the teachers unions. And so freedom, educational freedom is imperative, not just for, that you can open up, right? But that you can actually choose a school that meets your child's needs. I know I send my kids to Catholic school, but I did send one of my kids to public school for many years because that worked better for him. Again, we're not robots. And even within the same family, our children have different needs. And some of the kids that went to, one of my daughter went to public school last year because the public school is on Zoom. I moved her over to Catholic school this year so she could have in-person learning. Freedom of education, school choice, empowering parents to choose what's best for their kid is important. And when we have that choice, we can also choose what kind of education. And you and I both know there's a lot of indoctrination going on. And it used to be that you worried about it at the Marxist professor in college. Now it's going all the way down to elementary school where they're normalizing our kids to socialism. Parents need choices.
Thank you. You're absolutely right, Rachel. I really appreciate that perspective. So Kennedy, I'll pass it over to you. You can take over on the questions that we're getting on social media.
Hey, Daniel, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. So this is a great conversation. We're going to remind people, if you have more questions, please just leave them in the comments below. And of course, if we don't get to it, this is a continuing series. So we will have more of these discussions and we'll try and respond to them also in the comments afterwards. We'll respond to that. I have a really good question here to start things off, Daniel. You can start, and then Rachel, I'd like you to chime in as well as John. It says, do you think that we could improve the fairness of capitalism to keep the youth from going over to the socialist idea? I do agree with capitalism, but it's frustrating to see a few get rich off the labor from many. Maybe that's what makes it work.
Well, I think that the issue is that with capitalism, you're supposed to have fairness in terms of if you make a decision that does not generate profit, you should be held accountable. And we have seen time and time again in recent years where because someone has political influence or access to centers of power, they're not held accountable for their failures in the marketplace. And it's a case, and this goes back to Martin Luther King Jr. in the late 60s, who talked about in the United States a system where there was communism for the rich and capitalism for the poor. I think we need to have capitalism for everyone.
And I believe in equality of opportunity and not outcomes. And I think that we're not, again, instilling these very simple ideas at very young ages. And I think people have forgotten. I mean, fairness sounds really great. We all want fairness. But again, what does fairness look like? I can't equalize everybody, I have to take away from somebody in order to do that. What a society does need to do, and again, it goes back to what Daniel talked about with education being one of the key principles in giving people opportunity. If you have access to education and you have access to the kind of education that you think will best serve your child, and that is the opportunity that you need to get ahead.
Yeah, I would say, Kennedy, that that's absolutely right. I believe in redistribution of knowledge and equal opportunity, and that takes educational freedom and economic freedom hand in hand. There's a balance of both. To get that also, I think we need to be very active as individuals in helping to remove barriers that keep people from a good education, remove barriers that keep people from the marketplace. And, 30% of Latinos, for example, only speak Spanish. That's a major barrier to opportunity. Some of us, like 50% in some states, don't have a driver's license. 33% of us don't have a high school diploma. Those are major barriers to access the marketplace, to have equal opportunity. So in those areas, we could be working like we do at the Libre Initiative in providing expert help so that people can develop their skills and position them better in the marketplace. And then, of course, work for educational liberties that get them the kind of educational freedom that Rachel was talking about. And the last thing I'll say, right now we have a two-tiered justice system where those with title and money and position get treated one way by our justice system, and those without title, money, and position get treated an entirely different way. So we need to work together, both Democrats and Republicans, in improving our justice system, in advancing educational freedom and preserving economic freedom.
I got another one on Facebook here, Daniel. It's from Ginger. She says, can you please clarify the difference, and maybe John, you can start off with this one. Please clarify the difference of socialism combined with capitalism in our current government versus socialism in Venezuela, or is that communism? Is it actually coming to America in the form of democratic socialism or social democracy, or in any other form? I'm not sure how this looks exactly. I hope you understand what I'm trying to say.
Well, I think I touched on this earlier, but I'll go a little deeper. The United States has had two currents, which have been one, which has been a defense of the free market and capitalism, which you find in the Republican Party. And then since the administration of FDR, the Democratic Party, until the Clinton era, was very much defined by being the party of social democracy. And they were the ones who pushed through the New Deal. You see Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid during the Johnson administrations. But all of these programs operated on the premise that there needed to be a free market that generated the wealth that would be taxed by the state to provide these services. That's social democracy. And social democracy, you see it around the world and in Europe and other places. There are defects to it in terms of costs and inefficiencies, but it's not an assault on the market. It recognizes and accepts the market. Now, what we've been seeing over the last 20 years in the Democratic Party is you had these social democrats from the FDR, then you had neoliberals during the Clinton years that had were more beholden to Wall Street. And what we've seen more recently has been the rise of these democratic socialists that, unlike the social democrats, do not recognize the market as something positive and want to replace it. And that's where you have Bernie Sanders and AOC. And in that case, we're talking about something that would look like Venezuela or Cuba or North Korea. And another thing I wanted to say is I'm not as optimistic as either Daniel or Rachel in terms of what's going on globally for the following reason. I think the West and the United States made a existential error in building up communist China in the 1970s, 80s, and through the present. A regime, a communist regime that murdered 45 million of its people, and that's a conservative estimate. And those people have been continue in power, cannot be relied on as any kind of partner. And empowering them with subsidies and investments from the West and socializing risk so that American companies would go over there and build a manufacturing base, which now they've been able to turn into maximizing their military potential, is something that we've again, and we were talking about the United States and seeing wealth and what the products of a free society being taken for granted. We've taken for granted that since the 1700s until the present, we've had an Anglo American empire of liberty. And that may be ending, and it will be replaced by the Chinese, and it will be a very different international environment that will not be freedom-based or based on the rule of law. It'll be coercive and based in Maoism, which they still have the image of Mao in the center of their governing structures in Beijing. And I view that as a very problematic situation.
That is dire. And as you mentioned, those images of Mao are also at many of our universities. It's very scary. China is 100%, I'm glad you brought that up, 100% the most existential threat to our country right now. And I think China's alliance with and its ability to coordinate with big tech, with many of our corporations, I think it's all very, very troubling. And we must be aware. I mean, no one knows better than Hispanics that this freedom that we enjoy is not a permanent state. And I'm so glad that you're bringing so much of that up, John, because you're right. We do take so much of this for granted, and things can change very, very quickly. And as I've said throughout this pandemic, I've said it on television, and I've said it to my husband and to anyone I can talk to, I'm very concerned that we come out of this pandemic as Americans and not more like Chinese. And there are a lot of things that are happening, and it's all happening in real time, that we need to be much more aware of, because I think there's a lot going on.
So Rachel started off the question that I first asked, the fundamental question, what is socialism, which is government taking over the means of production, right? And so that's full on socialism. And then of course, China is full on communism, where the state has absolute authority over its the proletariat. But you know, Thomas Jefferson said it best, or I think it's attributed to him, or maybe not, there's some controversy. Government that governs least governs best. And so what we're saying is, in America, we're dangerously close to centralizing way too much power, way too much control in the hands of politicians, where they are dictating to us things that they should not, that are not constitutional. And that's a concern. I think it's, you know, when we talk about social programs, even the kind of dependency that is occurring because of the largesse of the government, look, it's not even so much about the wasted money. It's about the wasted lives. Folks who could be achieving so much more, who have so much potential and are capable of extraordinary things if they would untether themselves from, you know, the hooks of government and strike out on their own and leverage their talents and their skills in the marketplace, would have, I think, incredible wealth, you know, that so many are enjoying. And I think we're trapping people. And that's what I'm talking about, the wasted lives. Of course, look, we need to take care of those who are truly dependent. You know, the folks who are, you know, too old to take care of themselves, too small to take care of themselves, the disabled, you know, the special needs, veterans that we made promises to. There is a role for government. But I think for able-bodied people, we need to create opportunity. And opportunity comes obviously when we increase a quality education for that person. That's the kind of freedom we want to see, and move away from a top-down approach, the central command that we've been, I think, creeping towards.
I want to rebut a little bit.
Sure.
I think that when you talk about these people that are in need, I think one of the terrible side effects of the Great Society program, for example, that has a devastating impact on family structures and community structures, is that when you take responsibilities away from communities and hand it to government, you dry up those social bonds and social networks that are necessary for a free society. So I think that we need to have a healthy respect, or I think I'm a Catholic, so the idea of subsidiarity,
Sure.
of trying to have solutions at the most local level. And before going to the local government, let's look at families, neighbors,
100%.
and
Absolutely.
social organizations and NGOs. And then when they aren't able to handle the problem, then let's look at the local government. And then if the local government doesn't work, then we'll look at the state government and leave the federal government.
Thank you. That's a great correction. I appreciate that, John.
And I also want to say,
also,
in terms of you, in terms of your quote earlier from Jefferson, reminded me of Barry Goldwater, who said, "A government big enough to give you everything you want is big enough to take everything you have."
Absolutely.
That is very true. That is very true. I just want to mention, because you brought up the Great Society, this big war on poverty that we had, in the 60s. This is a perfect example of what we were talking about earlier. It sounds so good. Who wouldn't want to eliminate poverty? I believe there were lots of very good intentions around the creation of so many of these programs. But what was the result? The result is the destruction of the Black family, cycles of poverty and dependency, people who have forgotten, don't even have enough hope to think they can take advantage of the opportunities that do exist to move forward. It's very sad. And then in the end, when they're dependent, politicians know that and they want to take advantage of that. They want them to believe they can't do it, because if they can't do it for themselves, then they need those politicians. And so there becomes almost an incentive to keep people in poverty, to keep people dependent, because it increases the political power of other people. And one of the things I love about the Libre Initiative is that the Libre Initiative has always recognized what Hispanics have sort of culturally and familially, that has given them such strength, that entrepreneurship, that, lift yourself up, that we take care of each other. These are the reasons why Hispanics are the most entrepreneurial demographic in the entire country, not by a little, but by a long shot. And that's why I have so much hope for our community, because I believe that our community and our values are natural allies, if you will, work perfectly with what capitalism, free enterprise, and economic liberty have to offer. And clearly, as seductive as so much of what the left is putting forward, and when they wrap it in those terms of racial justice and equality and all of that, it sounds good. It never works.
Daniel, I have a whole bunch more questions, but I know that a lot of people, time is very important. I will say that the crystal balls are always bright, but the history books are kind of bleak. And we see that with socialism. I hope one day we can quote you guys, like you guys have quoted Milton Friedman and many others. But this conversation has been very good, very appreciated. I'm going to live in the chats for a couple hours here and going to respond to a lot of the questions that have been posed by everybody. Daniel, I'll give you the last word and invite everybody to continue following us on Facebook, following Rachel, John, and Daniel on Twitter and all of their social medias, as well as we will continue this conversation. Last word for you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Kennedy. And look, all I have to say is I want to express my gratitude to John and to Rachel for giving up their time, for giving us their great insights, expressing their concerns and their angst, but also their hope and the policy solutions that we can look forward to that are going to drive a free society, a society where there is mutual benefit, when there is voluntary exchange, when there is respect and tolerance for each other. And we'll continue these conversations, honest, insightful conversations about really those big ideas that are going to impact this generation as well as generations to come. So thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.